They define ending homelessness as when homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And I think those terms really resonate with my vision of 2050, where gender-based violence is rare, brief, and non-recurring. I think what's particularly powerful about those terms is they point us in a really clear direction.
Welcome to Voices Towards 2050, Ending Gender-Based Violence, the official podcast series of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission. Please be aware that this podcast discusses topics related to domestic, family and sexual violence, which may be distressing for some listeners. Support is available. If you need assistance, please contact 1-800-RESPECT or reach out to your local support services. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really pleased to welcome my guest on today's episode of the podcast. Quinn, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation about how we can shape a future free from gender-based violence.
It's a pleasure to be here.
First, I want to start by acknowledging that today I'm joining from the lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to their elders, past and present, for their care of these lands and for their generosity and wisdom. I am very lucky to be looking out over waterways, and I know that these lands and waterways have been cared for very, very well for thousands of years. My commitment is to work and live as an ally in this role and always. Just let me take a minute to introduce our guest. Dr. Quinn is a survivor with diverse expertise from lived experience, policy and research. They are passionate about advocating for safer housing and mobility for victim survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. They are a member of the Commission's Lived Experience Advisory Council and always bring thoughtful wisdom to our conversations. Quinn, I'm so pleased to have a chance to talk to you about our vision for the future today.
Thank you, Micaela. It really is a pleasure to be here to have a platform for lived experience. It's such an important, I think, opportunity.
And critical for all of us to be learning from. I think we've talked many times about the greatest wisdom about really understanding problems, solutions, how things get rolled out really does come from lived experience as close to the problem as you can get.
Absolutely.
So Quinn, tell me a little bit about what motivates you to strive for a different future.
That's such a great question. I think for me, when I look around at people with lived experience and other advocates, whether they're out in public or sort of in their quiet personal advocacy, I'm really just inspired by their strength, resilience and optimism. Mm. I think I'm always so grateful when people share not only their experiences, but their own visions for the future. I think lived experience, and I'm sure this is not a surprise, but it's really the key to any solution for domestic, family and sexual violence. Mm. Without those voices, it's really hard to get solutions that are going to work in context. And I think really importantly, it's always awesome to really hear the way that people with lived experience challenge the assumptions that underpin policies and programs. I think this is always really clear for me with every conversation that I have that people are paying attention to who is empowered and who's not empowered by different policies and how processes need to change either at that program level or even at a systems level.
Quinn, I think that's so true, and I feel like in this role I've learnt that more and more, even though, in a very concrete way, I've observed the value of the experience that you and others and expertise bring to conversations. And I think the point you made about challenging, I think keeping people slightly on their toes about challenging their assumptions about knowing what's going to work is incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
So, Quinn, this conversation is about the future. So if our national commitment to ending gender-based violence in one generation is successful, what would your vision for what 2050 would look like be?
It's such a fantastic question because it really gets to the heart of, I think, what I'm passionate about. Both raising the profile of lived experience, but also being a massive policy nerd. I have a keen interest in how we can embed lived experience leadership in policy design. And so when I think about that question, a violence-free 2050, I actually look to some of my friends down in Melbourne in the homelessness sector. And they have this A to Z, Advanced to Zero campaign. And their goal is actually to end homelessness, so quite similar.
Mm.
And I think there they define ending homelessness as when homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And I think those terms really resonate with my vision of 2050, where gender-based violence is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And I think what's particularly powerful about those terms is they point us in a really clear direction. So for domestic, family, and sexual violence to be rare, it means that everyone has the resources to maintain positive well-being, whether that's psychological, financial, or social, like their connection to the community. For violence to be brief, I think it means we've managed to surround people with those really important protective factors and strong social infrastructure. I think when someone experiences violence, I would hope that they would have access to a safe place to live without having to risk their livelihood or their children's education, and that safe place could be through a strong support network, either family, friends, or services, or a combination. And I think lastly, for violence to be non-recurring, I think that means that we've managed to have effective holistic responses for people using violence. And I guess when I think about that, I think that means strong healing and recovery responses, particularly for young men and boys who have experienced violence. I find there's a tendency to look at interventions for people using violence as either a prevention or a response. But when I look at the research, it tells us that many, many people who have used violence have experienced violence or complex trauma. So given that, I think interventions for those using violence are almost always, at first, a healing and recovery initiative before we can move on to the intervention. So I think those terms really set out my vision for 2050.
Quinn, that is such a helpful framing, because so often I have conversations about what does a violence-free future mean, and people are dismissive of our capacity to achieve it because they think it means there will be no violence. But that framing really helps us. It's not, it won't, we're not saying it's going to disappear, but it's talking about how we're responding to it differently. And that's an incredibly helpful way to frame it. So we'll hold on to that, Quinn. If you could travel through time to that vision of 2050 and spend a few days there, what would you, as a policy nerd and a researcher who I chuckle because I feel we have valued enormously from what you bring to these conversations because of that, what questions would you have?
I mean, look, I suppose I would want to know what worked, but maybe more importantly, I think, how did we get there? I think I often find myself saying in some of these conversations that outcomes are great and they are important, but how we get there is just as important. And so I think I would really want to know, how did government, academics, lived experience, and practitioners all come together to share knowledge, share power, and collaborate? Something I'm really passionate about is really raising that profile of lived experience as expertise. And I think on that in Australia, we're very lucky to have some great work on that. So we have ANRO's Australian National Research Agenda, and what I really value about that is it really clearly outlines how practitioners, academics, and lived experience knowledge holders can actually come together to end gender-based violence. So you got your academics, they play such an important role in bringing specialist technical knowledge and really relinquishing a lot of power to platform lived experience. Practitioners from community services bring a critical perspective about what's working in context on the ground. And I think in the context of lived experience advocacy, they play such a significant role in actually advocating to government both with and for people with lived experience, particularly when those people are maybe not yet able to advocate for themselves or haven't yet been given a seat at the table. And then I think, of course, lived experience, it's the foundation of any solution to end gender-based violence. They're equipped with tangible solutions, they work in context, and they challenge those assumptions that underpin those policies and programs. And I guess lastly, when we think about government's role in all of this, it's one thing to be able to facilitate this work, but really I think it's inspiring when government is able to actively promote and value it. Because I think, in the absence of evidence from lived experience expertise or any other form of expertise, people will create their own stories about gender-based violence. So uplifting each of those voices is really important. So yeah, I guess that's what I would want to know. How did government actually bring together these experts, and how did they provide that platform in the public discourse for lived experience?
Yeah, I think that point about process and how we get there is centrally important, is one that we need to keep exploring together. And I really do value how much you bring that expertise to the National Lived Experience Advisory Council and helping us think through the role that the council plays and all of the council members play in helping inform government's work on that journey, because we've got a long way to go still, but we've got some fabulous people who are providing expertise into that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no end point to learning, right? So every conversation I'm learning something new, and I think that really speaks to the process of having many voices around the table.
Completely agree. So, Quinn, my last question. If you had the ability to make any necessary change from the perspective that you're bringing to this conversation, so I'm not saying the one thing will change everything, but from your perspective, what is the one thing you would do now to work towards achieving a violence-free 2050?
Just one thing.
I know it's a very hard question. It is. It is an impossible ask, but it's what I'm trying to get to is how do we prioritise?
So I guess, I think this is where I reflect a little bit on my experience so far as a lived experience advocate. So I think just the one thing I would like to see is to see more platforms for lived experience advocacy across every organisation, government or not. And I think when I reflect on my experience being part of consultations, I think as a whole in Australia, we're becoming quite rehearsed at engaging with lived experience, but maybe not necessarily any more practice just yet. So I think at the moment we're still in that phase where we might be bringing in lived experience a little bit too late, or maybe not quite made clear in final products just how lived experience has informed changes to our project. And so I'd really like to see, lived experience advocates cited alongside academics in research and policy. But I think tangibly, the change I would make if I had a magic wand,
I'm giving it to you, Quinn.
I'd really like to see things like lived experience review of project proposals becoming standard practice, and I'd really like to see the creation and funding of projects that are actually led by lived experience advocates and supported by practitioners and academics. And I guess by projects, I don't necessarily mean more projects unpacking the problem. As I said earlier, I think people with lived experience are equipped with solutions. But I mean projects that are focusing on implementing what we've learned so far about domestic, family and sexual violence over the years. If I had to give one sort of really concrete example, I think of how we might upskill different generalist services like healthcare professionals who have such an important opportunity in early intervention and responding to DFV. But I think they have a little bit of a different framework at the moment than in other spaces. So if I had a magic wand, I would put a project to tender to be led by lived experience that designs like a training program and a framework for healthcare professionals responding to domestic, family and sexual violence. And I think by doing this, by having it be led by lived experience expertise from the start, being supported by academics and the practitioners who are doing the work every day, I think you'd end up with like a really cool evidence-based, probably trauma-informed practical tool that would help improve how we respond to domestic, family and sexual violence.
Do you know what gives me enormous hope about that, Quinn, is that's eminently doable, isn't it? There's nothing holding us back from doing that and starting there. And what you're talking about is some very practical steps that I agree, I think could really accelerate and move us forward.
Absolutely. I think we have some of the most brilliant minds and the most awesome practitioners throughout Australia. And I think the motivation and desire is there. I think it's really just that opportunity.
Okay, so Quinn, our job is to help make that opportunity real, and let's keep working on that together.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Quinn. I've enjoyed it, and I've learnt even more just talking with you for a short time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Voices Towards 2050, Ending Gender-Based Violence. Subscribe and join us for future conversations as we work together to achieve a future free from domestic, family and sexual violence. To learn more about the Commission, visit our website at dfsvc.gov.au. If you need support, contact 1800-RESPECT or call 1800-737-732. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you can call 13-YARN or 139276. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views of the Australian Government or the Commission.